Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Center for Security Governance's third eSeminar, New Frontiers in Security Sector Reform, Countering Technology-Driven Threats. We're very glad you could make it, and we're excited to welcome a terrific panel of speakers today. First, I just want to give a quick technical overview of Spreecast, the platform we're using for this event. Some of you are viewing the event on the Spreecast website, which I'll put in the chat box here. Others are viewing it on the Center for Security Governance's event page. Both groups will be able to view the presentations, but if you'd like to engage more by asking questions and making comments, we suggest that you take part using the Spreecast website. If you're on the Center's website and would like to access the full user experience, simply move your cursor over the presentation box and click on the button that says Try the Full Experience. You can quickly sign in using any of your existing social media accounts or your email address. Once we get underway, you'll have a few ways to interact with the panel today. You can ask questions and discuss with other users in the chat box. You can also ask questions in the area below the presenters, labeled Viewer Questions and Suggestions. Should you have any technical problems during the event, please do not hesitate to contact me, Jeff Burt, at the Center for Security Governance using this email address. Without any further delay, I'll pass the floor to Mark Sedra, the Executive Director of the Center, to make some introductory remarks. Mark?
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you all to the third installment of our eSeminar series. My name is, as my colleague Jeff said, my name is Mark Sedra, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Security Governance, or CSG. As we're a new organization, we're just over a year old, let me say a few words about who we are. The Center for Security Governance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to the study of security transitions in fragile, failed, and conflict-affected states, a process also commonly known as security sector reform. We are a registered charity based in Kitchener, Canada, which, for those of you who don't know, the area is near Toronto. The Center works to advance new ideas and approaches to security and justice reform, broaden the debate over security governance among academics, practitioners, and the public at large, and enhance the effectiveness of donor security assistance in fragile, failed, and conflict-affected states. We launched this eSeminar series shortly after the launch of our organization to stimulate open and vibrant debate about innovative and forward-looking topics in our field. So now that I have that out of the way, the introductions, let me also say a few words about why we chose this particular topic for today's eSeminar. Now, I don't need to explain to this audience the scale of the challenge posed by the diverse array of current cybersecurity threats, whether it's cyber crime, cyber vandalism, cyber espionage, or even cyber warfare. We are confronted with these threats on a daily basis. In recent years, powerful states from around the world have created whole new layers of security governance and infrastructure to address these threats. However, this is not just a problem affecting the powerful, but also developing and fragile states. In our research and advisory work on security governance issues around the world, we've increasingly witnessed firsthand how under-resourced security sectors in developing countries are struggling to keep up with this fluid threat. It has become increasingly clear to us that cybersecurity and other technology-driven threats, such as the use of drones and other forms of robotics and warfare, should be factored into security assistance to fragile and developing states. Now, this is a new idea that few others in our field have broached, so I thought that we would start a debate here. Now, with that short explanation, let me welcome our superb lineup of speakers who will shed some light on this issue. Now, as Jeff said, I think we're very fortunate to have secured such a distinguished group of speakers. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Ken Taylor, our first speaker, is currently the president of the International Cybersecurity Protective Alliance for the Americas. He is also the CEO of Innova Nord and is recognized as a global cybersecurity leader. Ken is a fellow of New Westminster College in British Columbia and is a member of the advisory board of the Inter-Association Working Group on Cybersecurity. Ken served in the Canadian Armed Forces for over 12 years in both peace and wartime operations throughout the world. So I'd like to thank Ken for joining us. Jeffrey Carr, our second speaker, is the author of Inside Cyber Warfare, Mapping the Cyber Underworld. And he's also the founder and CEO of Taya Global Inc., a boutique security consulting firm for Global 2000 companies. His book has been widely endorsed in the field. His firm provides specialized cybersecurity services to a select group of companies and their executives in the defense, technology, and communication sectors worldwide. Finally, we're very proud to also have Tim Maurer join us, who focuses on cyberspace and international affairs at the New America Foundation. His current projects center on cyber warfare and the global cybersecurity norms process, transatlantic cooperation on security and freedom in the digital age, internet freedom, especially in the context of US sanctions and export controls, and research on swing states in the international internet governance debate. He is part of New America's Future of War project and the research advisory network of the Global Commission on Internet Governance. So as you can see, we really have a really informed, distinguished group to help shed light on this issue today. Each speaker will have roughly 15 minutes for their presentation. Following the presentations, I will moderate a Q&A discussion for roughly 40 minutes. At that time, the audience, as my colleague Jeff said, will be able to ask questions or make comments in the text box, and I really encourage you to do so. The more of you that take part, the more useful this discussion will be. Feel free also during the event to use the social media buttons on the screen to share your thoughts on the event. One of my other colleagues will be live tweeting some of the important issues and ideas that will be presented here. The video from this event will be open to the public on our website after today, and we will produce a summary report that will be published in the coming days, which will include some recommendations that came out of the discussion. Let me also remind you that you can download our brief eSeminar primer report, framing some of the key issues and themes being discussed here on our website at any time. It's up there now. So without any further ado, let me pass the floor to our first speaker, Ken Taylor. My colleague Jeff will now bring Ken up on the screen. Thank you very much for joining us here today, and Ken, you have the floor.
Thank you and good morning. I believe it's fitting to be talking about this subject with the backdrop of Mexico City here today, and to talk about developing countries in terms of cybercrime. So what I'd like to do is kind of give you a 10-minute snapshot of what the ICSPA has continued to advocate across the globe with a variety of leaders in a variety of countries, both those in first world as well as second and third world countries. So with that said, I think I'd just like to kind of give you a general thought around what we have been seeing over the past couple of years. As was mentioned earlier, the ICSPA is a global organization focused on cybercrime, specifically bringing in to the fold government and corporate agencies together to share information and to talk about what's happening and to facilitate moving forward in a proactive stance. So I'd start off by saying that what we have been seeing a lot of is in developing countries. A lot of those countries have newer infrastructure. So whether it be high-speed broadband, mobile phones, social media, cloud computing, all of those things have the potential really to spawn economic growth. In a lot of those countries that we are visiting and speaking with, that is such the case. Online banking, I believe, has become one of the premier focus areas as well as in as many of these developing countries. But with this growth and this new technologies in these countries, there is a downside, as we all know. And without the right type of policy and enforcement tools, education and training in place,
this leads to an open playground, if you will, for cyber criminals, which we have seen, especially over the last 3 years. And what's happening is the cyber criminals are using these developing nations' infrastructure as their staging ground to conduct DDoS attacks, release 0 days and malicious code, create virtual money laundering facilities, etc. And all of these things that I'm talking about are well known and well publicized. But what I believe is truly missing from a societal perspective, and again, this is a failing across the board in all nations that we meet with, including our own in the G5, is the awareness component and the education and training that's actually tied into that. Because ultimately it's critical from a start perspective to have the awareness so that your organization knows what's going on. So I think that's a place where I'd like to go and spend a few minutes and talk about a framework that we are advocating with leadership across the world. And it's a very simple framework, but it's one that's drawn from years of experience within our organization and others, both through the military and the commercial sides. And what we've done is put it into layman's terms and talk specifically about 4 key areas. So let me just speak to those areas, and then I'll turn the floor over to the next speaker. So the first area is assets. So we talk about assets, technology, awareness, education, training, and proactive cyber posture. So assets, what do I mean by assets? So an organization has to be able to identify and prioritize their key assets. So let's use a bank, for example. So a bank would say, for instance, their key asset or their key priority as far as identifying their assets in their organization is their clients' information. So that's number one as far as a priority is concerned. Number two may be internal infrastructure. So once an organization understands and prioritizes their assets and puts them in place, the next thing they need to do is understand the technologies that they're currently using to protect those assets, and then what technologies they should be looking at to further the protection of those assets. So again, if I go back to the bank and I look at client data as the number one asset, maybe we could go down a path to say that that organization should be using multi-factor authentication of some type to protect that asset, maybe using encryption technology to protect that. And then the number two asset, same thing, they would use maybe a different technology, not as robust, but still effective enough. So you identify and prioritize your assets inside your organization. You then understand the right technologies to be using to protect those. And then the third one is really, again, around the awareness, the education, and the training component. So the awareness is critical, and they start internally. And there are so many different mediums that we can deliver content today to an organization, whether that be using the internet through PDF or video, or weekly or daily meetings or updates that you have. But there needs to be an awareness campaign, and that awareness really needs to focus on what's happening in technology today. Because we all know every 24 milliseconds something is changing in the world that we're in from a technology perspective. So it is the responsibility of organizations to ensure their people are aware of what is going on and understand that it's evolving and changing as we go. And then, of course, in line and dovetailing into awareness is an education and training program that is tailored to an organization. So if I go back to the bank, typically what should happen inside of a bank, and I do see this a lot with banks. I was just meeting with some banks in Canada on Tuesday, actually, in Toronto. They understand how to prioritize and identify their assets, and they're doing that well. The technologies as well, they're identifying using the right technologies in some cases, but where they're lacking the experience is the education and training. And so that's where we, as an organization, as a not-for-profit as well, often defer clients to meet with specific organizations that create education and training programs that come in, scope the environment, understand what the needs are of the client, and then tailor programs specifically for their organization. If I'm using the bank as the example, a lot of banks now are not only doing it internally, but turning it externally out to their client facing, because arguably It is the responsibility of the organization to ensure their clients are aware of how to use the tools that they have in place. So you have the assets, you have the technology, you have the awareness, education, and training. All of these things are critical because if you think of an organization, any organization, what happens is you have a variety of siloed groups, whether they be a finance group, the engineering group, the sales group, the communications group, the executive group, and they all operate in different silos within an organization. Yet, they're all asked and required to use technologies in order to access the assets that we spoke about. So again, the education and training really has to focus on those assets and the technologies in place. And then the last piece of the framework that we speak about with quite regularity is a proactive cyber posture, is what we like to call it. And really, this is the area where the organization, once it's identified and prioritized its assets, it's using the right technologies to allow their organization to access those assets and do their thing. And they've made everybody aware. They're using education and training. It's to then turn around and exercise against themselves. And whether that be running tabletop drills, if you think of it, for instance, from a fire alarm perspective, fire drills, all organizations have, a committee that's formed internally and then drills and specific rules that they have to follow. Well, it's no dissimilar in cybersecurity. Organizations have to be proactive. They have to test against themselves and ensure that the technologies for one, so using third parties, for instance, bringing in third parties to test their cyber defensives, as well as the awareness component. So having internal people sending internal phishing emails from the IT department to make sure that people aren't clicking those links. And then having programs internally that reward those employees who are proactive, who behave the right way, who use the chain of command, if you will, to make people aware. So again, that's a framework that's really come out over the past 5 years from a variety of organizations that we've worked with and talked with, from experience that many of us have had within the ICSPA, both from military experiences as well as the commercial side. And then we've looked at frameworks, for instance, that have come out of DHS and other places in the UK and Canada to kind of put together this simplistic format so that we can educate those to understand how to move forward. So I think I'll stop my piece there and turn it back over to the MC, and I look forward to questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Ken. That was very interesting stuff. I mean, I certainly noted the idea of awareness raising, education, the idea, particularly on in reference to looking at the developing world, how it serves in many ways as a staging ground for some of the threats that are being projected around the world in the cybersecurity area. So I look forward to engaging those issues with you in the discussion period. But now I think we're going to pass the floor to our next speaker, who is Jeffrey Carr. So Jeffrey, you have the floor. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, the opportunity. I wanted to take about 10 minutes to talk about a few what I think are critical issues that always need further discussion. I think it's important that governments collaborate with each other in matters having to do with cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, including their own. The most rational governments understand that the violent disruption of major financial, telecommunications, and energy, transportation sectors serve no one. So the strategic key here is to identify non-government actors, chaotic actors, who have no allegiances except to cause disruption or to cause harm. These might be terrorists, they might be anarchists, they might be religious fanatics, nationalist extremists, such as even ones we have here in the US that seek to overthrow the US government and instill some form more amenable to their beliefs. These are the groups I think that pose the worst threat. And it's these types of groups, which every country has, that governments, world governments, can find a common ground to collaborate on. For example, here in the U.S. Government has frequently tried to tackle the problem of acts of Chinese cyber espionage, acts which many officials in the U.S. government and in the Department of Defense and in the private sector have all agreed that the scope is enormous, is vast, is affecting perhaps billions of dollars. There's also, I think, an underlying fear that China's technological acceleration is a little concerning. The U.S., I'm sure, does not want to have to deal with a more and more powerful Chinese presence in Asia. So we're sort of, fumbling around trying to find ways to force China to stop its theft of high value technology. I think that's a fool's errand. It's never going to work. China will never agree, and we don't have the ability to force China to agree, nor does any other country. In fact, there's a certain component of hypocrisy to any attempt that we make to do that, since our intelligence agencies, like every intelligence agency, will do what is necessary to secure the position, safety, sustainability of its power and its presence in the world. So I think the fact that we do not have state-owned enterprises here, the way they do in France and China, is possibly the only reason why the NSA or the CIA is not engaging in economic espionage for corporate benefit. We just don't have that. We're not set up that way. So I think taking the high ground in that area is it's wrong. It's hypocritical and it's terrible policy. On the other hand, I do think it's possible to collaborate with China in the same manner that you would collaborate with any country, and that is to find a common ground where both sides win, even if in some limited way. I mean, indeed, this is the object of diplomacy, as far as I understand it. In the case of China, they have a serious problem with hackers attacking their own infrastructure. These hackers might come from inside of China. They might come from Taiwan, they might come from Tibet, they might come from India, they may come from Korea. Just as the U.S. suffers in this way, so does the Chinese government, so does the Russian government as well. And the strategy, I think, works universally. So the FBI has been successful in the past in collaborating with its partner agencies across the world. There are many examples of the FBI and a foreign law enforcement agency working together and identifying and arresting hackers who are engaging in criminal acts. Well, the same approach should work with hackers operating inside of China who are attacking Chinese government websites or other malicious acts, acts that the Chinese government it would be in their interest to help stop. So that would be one way. That would also, by the way, yield a lot of very good intelligence about who these independent actors are, because right now it's obvious that we are not making a differentiation between actions being conducted by a state agency versus actions that are being conducted by independent hacker groups. So this would allow us, this would grant us access to new sources of intelligence, on the ground intelligence, human-driven intelligence, which is severely missing in the world of cyber security intelligence and threat intelligence. Almost all of which is gained purely through electronic means, rather than a combination of signals intelligence and human intelligence or all source intelligence. So This is, I think, is an important distinction that we should attempt to make. Build bridges between governments and identify the real threats, which are these chaotic actors that could cause serious harm and have no economic incentive not to. The second point that I'd like to make during my time is the lack of importance, actually, for corporations to understand who it is that's attacking them. Corporations they have a limited budget as it is for cybersecurity. Most people in that department understand that they're not getting enough money to do their job. So given the resources that they do have, trying to identify whether an attack is coming from Korea, China, Russia, Germany, France, Israel, it honestly, it doesn't matter. The way that you defend your assets, your resources, would be the same anyway. And by that I mean it should be data centric. So a company's focus, or a corporation or a nonprofit organization's focus, shouldn't be on keeping bad guys out. It should be on keeping what is valuable to them, their crown jewels, in. Sort of think of it like even like the human body. We all carry around, God only knows how many viruses and germs and bugs. That's just life. I mean, and that's life today on a digital network. You simply cannot keep out a dedicated attacker. What you can do, however, is identify the critical assets that reside on your network and make it harder for those assets to be accessed, to be copied, to be stolen. And in this way, you not only defend against any external threat coming from any country, but you also defend against your an even more difficult threat, which is the insider, the trusted insider. So I think if we assume this, what I've called, what others have called, an assumption of breach paradigm for corporations, for NGOs, and even for governments, that would allow us to use our resources in a more effective way. The resources that, in fact, are quite limited. Attribution, I do want to underscore, is important, is critically important if we're talking about governments. Because then you have to know who has attacked you in order to weigh your options and your response. So my advice for corporations regarding this is don't worry about it. My advice for governments is it's absolutely critical that you do it right. And I think with those remarks, I'll end my part of the talk and await questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey. That was very interesting. I mean, a lot of takeaway points there, talking about the importance of focusing on chaotic groups or extremist groups. The key point about collaboration, I'd like us all to think about that in collaboration. This is what, for instance, security sector reform is all about, collaborating between donors as well as state and non-state actors in developing and fragile states to address some of these threats. And building bridges between governments, building bridges between the public and private spheres. So I think these are all important issues that we'll be able to address during the discussion period. Let me all just remind you that feel free to start discussing things or to raising questions. We already have one question in our question area at the bottom of the screen, but also feel free to start making comments and adding questions in the chat box as well, which we will address during the discussion period after the final presentation. So with that, I'm going to pass the floor to Tim Maurer, who will give our final presentation. So you have the floor, Tim.
Tim, sorry to jump in here. We're not able to hear you right now.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes. Okay.
All right, back, Mark and Jeff. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn on the mic. First of all, let me thank you for having me today. And I'm going to speak about the issues facing developing countries with regard to cybercrime and cybersecurity, and thought that I outline some of the key themes that the previous speakers haven't picked up on yet to complement what they were speaking about. So first, I thought it might be good to point out that we are currently at a point where the internet has reached 2 billion people in the world, which means that there are another 5 billion people out there that don't have access yet. And those 5 billion tend to live in the developing world. So that in terms of the users that are currently using the infrastructure, most of them are in the developed country. And of the people that currently do have access in the developing world, they tend to use it through their mobile phones, which, if we are talking about the devices and the way that people are using the internet, is also slightly different in terms of distribution than if we're talking about users, let's say in Europe, the United States, or some of the developed Asian countries. So that means that I think in order to approach this topic with a specific focus on developing countries, one is the source of crime, and then the others being the target of crime. If we're talking about cybercrime as an issue. And if we're talking about the victim side, so being the targets of crime, I think what's clear here is that this is a problem that will continue to grow in the future as we see more and more people coming online and in that part of the world. And the current projection is that we'll see another 2 billion people come online over the next 5 years. And the top 5 countries of those 2 billion are all located in Asia. So in terms of thinking about international assistance and prioritizing where the focus should be, it's clearly that Asia is the focus in terms of new users coming online, and what Ken mentioned earlier in terms of awareness raising, that there's a lot that needs to be done specifically in that region. The source of crime is a different issue where it's obviously not necessarily dependent on how many people are online in that part of the world, as long as you have enough people that know what to do and how to use this infrastructure for criminal purposes. And here, the internet has provided means that are fairly easy to access. So the barriers of entry to use the internet for criminal purposes is fairly low compared to some other criminal activity. And it's transnational in nature because of the way the internet works. And that's obviously not a unique phenomenon, but it poses some key questions. And Jeff earlier pointed to the attribution problem and the challenges to find out who is actually behind an attack. Now, this obviously does not apply across the board, but depends on the level of sophistication of the actors that are involved in carrying out the activity. And the best example in the sense of the best known when it comes to criminal activity from developing countries is probably your email scam that we've all gotten in the 1990s and that continue today, even though I have to say I've gotten less of them in recent years. But email scams, in terms of level of sophistication, are obviously quite low. They're nothing compared to the level of sophistication and capability of, for example, Russian criminal groups. So if we're talking about cybercrime, I think we also need to have some notion of scale of what we're talking about and trying to identify what the problem really is and what the challenges are with regard to developing countries. And the scale is here from the email scam to some activity that we've seen in recent past from some of the sophisticated groups that range to an non-state actor hacking into power grids and taking control of the power grids, and then submitting a ransom note and asking people to pay. So that's in terms of scale is a different level of sophistication that's required by the criminal groups to be able to carry out that activity. So now I've talked a little bit about cybercrime. And before I go on to cybersecurity, I should point out that when I say developing countries, I do exclude China from that group. So even though obviously China is part of the G77, for the purposes of this presentation and the focus of what I believe this discussion is about, I'll exclude China as from my list of developing countries. So let me briefly talk about cybersecurity, the other big piece that you wanted us to talk about today. And I think here we need a little bit more of a, I'll need to explain a little bit more about the different dimensions to cybersecurity, because it's become a term that's been used by very different people for very different purposes. And I think one way to approach it, first to conceptualize cybersecurity a little bit in its different pieces, is to think of it from the international security perspective, the national security perspective, and then the individual security or human security dimension. And if later on in the discussion, I think it'll be important for us to distinguish if we are talking about the international piece or the human security piece. Which leads me to my other point, that in the international debate, you have, to simplify, two different terms for cybersecurity. You have the term information security and you have the term cybersecurity. And information security is the term that's being used by the Russian government and the Chinese government. And cybersecurity has been the term that's been advanced by the US government as well as the European governments. The key distinction is that the definition of information security includes threats that are considered to undermine the social stability of a state, which most experts in the US and Europe interpret to mean the control of content, which turns the debate about cybersecurity, if we use the term information security, into a debate and a Trojan horse for human rights debate, actually. So if you accept the notion of information security, including content, then we also get into an area where, for example, surveillance and the intrusion of devices of individual citizens for the purposes of spying on them and monitoring them would fall under the category of cyber/information security. I'd like to take a slightly different approach and suggest that we focus on cybersecurity as understood and advanced by the US and Europe, which excludes content from that discussion and tries to, what Jeff pointed out in his presentation earlier, tries to shift the focus on the critical infrastructure piece and cybersecurity and cyber threats that don't manipulate content consumed by humans as such, but that change data in a system and can lead to a degradation of, for example, the financial system, or the deletion of data of certain systems that are necessary to operate, for example, an oil company's management system. With that, I wanted to have a few final points with regard to cybersecurity more generally and developing countries. One is the issue of asymmetry. So we know that developed countries are more vulnerable overall compared to less developed countries because we use a lot more devices and technologies that are connected to the internet. So there are a lot more machines that can be hacked, and the consequences can be a lot more severe. But at the same time, if we're looking at developing countries, the asymmetry is slightly different in that developing countries are more vulnerable when it comes to specific targets because they might not be the latest technology and might not have the level of defenses that developed countries are able to mount. And there's a lack of resilience compared to developed countries, there's less resilience in the system at large. So there are fewer redundancies that, in case of a cyber incident, would allow you to switch to a different system to replace the system that's been affected. And then last but not least, if we're talking about international assistance, so the kind of capacity building that we see in every other range when it comes to any other security area, and you mentioned the security sector reform, we see very similar issues when it comes to cybercrime and cybersecurity. The lack of capacity in many countries in terms of knowledge and expertise, the lack of capacity specifically in governments in those countries. And I think one point that I wanted to highlight is that when it comes to cybersecurity, it's obviously a key challenge is the educational piece and making sure that people have the technical expertise and capacity to address the threats. But the challenge here is it's not just, we can't just educate people so they have a degree and then we know for the next 20 years they have the tools they need to address a given problem, which is like one of our approaches in many other areas when it comes to training in those countries. We believe like we give them training for 2 or 3 years and they'll have the essential skills that will enable them to carry out that task in the next decade or two. The challenge with cybersecurity is that because the technology is changing so fast and the applications and platforms, you need to have a continuing educational program in place so that the people continue to keep up their training and remain up to speed in terms of the latest technologies and the threats that are associated with it. So with that, I'm going to finish here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Tim. There was so much there to think about. That was really fantastic. Let me first of all compliment our speakers. I don't think I've ever been to an event where everyone's stuck so closely to time. That is really impressive. So thank you all for being so disciplined. I really appreciate that. I mean, I see so many common themes here stretching across the presentations. And I think, Tim, really very well pointed out that because there is still limited connectivity in many developing countries, that it's really the threats that these countries pose in some ways to more connected countries in the West. But also, as well, looking at the fact that many of their systems lack resiliency, there's critical vulnerabilities there, which I think pose a threat both domestically, but also because of the fact that in our global interconnected world can reverberate across those borders as well. So those vulnerabilities domestically could also have pose threats to those outside. I think this is always one of the most important factors in encouraging donor states to commit resources is the fact that there is a potential threat to their own populations that is posed by some of the vulnerabilities in these developing states in the cybersecurity realm. So maybe I will ask the first question. I'll take advantage of my position as chair here, although I see we already have 2 questions below that we can pose in a few minutes. But I just wanted to ask a very general question. All of you touched to a certain degree on the issue of training, collaboration. Jeffrey mentioned the need even for diplomacy. How, if we look specifically at developing countries, and there's a wide range of developing countries, not necessarily just basket cases, but more advanced developing countries as well. How could we, if you were to advise donors in Canada, the United States, the UK, on how to advance a program to do what maybe what Tim said, which is continual training, continual capacity building. That's one approach. How would you advise them to build these bridges, as Jeff talked about, to advance collaboration, to address some of these threats? Not just now, because as Tim said, there's still limited connectivity, but this connectivity is growing. And so this threat in many ways will expand over time. So if I could ask you to take on the role of senior policy advisor, how would you advise governments, donor governments today in terms of this training, awareness raising, capacity building piece? So maybe I'll go in the reverse order from your presentations. I'll start with Tim, and then we'll go to Jeff, and then finally Ken. So Tim, go ahead.
I will focus on only one point, so that'll make it easier for Jeff and Ken to add something else. One is, I think, a key question of who's going to be your partner on the ground. And I think that's one of the key questions when we're talking about assistance when it comes to cybersecurity, because when we look at the UN system and the international community, the ITU is the traditional organization that's been doing this. But the ITU has gotten itself into a very nasty political fight right now, being perceived to be representative or primarily dominated by the views of the Russian and the Chinese government. But apart from that political system, if we are looking just at the operational aspect of that, the ITU doesn't have operational programs on the ground. The ITU in developing countries is represented through the representative of the United Nations Development Program. So that even if the ITU would want to provide more technical assistance, there is a bit of a challenge. They don't have the presence on the ground. They're based on the traditional models from the 50s and 60s of sending international experts to country for 3 to 6 months. They say, here's what we believe that you should implement. They leave, and then everything will be better in a happy place. So one, that's an outdated model that is currently no longer the basis for the assistance that's provided by the international community. And if that's not the case, the question becomes, what fills that gap? Is it bilateral assistance programs? Is it other multinational, now I'm missing the word, intergovernmental organizations? So first, who's your local partner? And I think because of the lack of an organization right now that can do that and the need to address it, my recommendation would be to first focus on existing bilateral ties for the countries that are most in need.
Well, thanks. I don't have a good answer. I'm not sure that there's an organization that's in place to do this, which addresses all of the concerns that any developing country should have. Unfortunately, the bulk of the Snowden revelations have cast a huge shadow over the use of any of the internet backbone that is owned by U.S. Telecommunications providers. So until that has been very publicly addressed, I would not encourage any country to use one source, whether it comes from the U.S. or China or any other large country, for the beneficial development of their own infrastructure. I would be more inclined to support an international organization's efforts. I do agree that the ITU is probably not that organization, but I'm sure that there are others. I'm not as well versed in it as perhaps the other gentlemen on this panel, and so I'm hoping to learn, what some options might be.
Great point. I think that obviously developing countries should have some significant concerns in terms of looking for one sole source provider of assistance. And I mean, I think that's a recommendation in of itself to build international infrastructure, perhaps some that aren't necessarily dominated by particular states, that could provide that sort of assistance. And perhaps even it's from non-state actors as well, as opposed to intergovernmental actors. So that's very interesting. Okay, Ken, maybe you can round it off. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you both for your comments. I would say that the International Cybersecurity Protection Alliance is in a unique position to probably comment on this and maybe fill in the audience. I'll give you some examples of some of the proactive things that we've been doing. So internally, both in the UK as well as as Canada, we've advised the current governments that are in place around specific forums and conferences and working groups that the governments themselves can take part in. From a policy perspective, if I refer early on to Tim speaking specifically about the ITU, we at the ICSPA have been very proactive and involved with the Budapest Convention, which I know the other speakers are familiar with, which is a convention on cybercrime that was established in 2004. It addresses issues around infringement of copyright, fraud, child pornography, hate crimes, etc. And it is a convention that has 50 member countries in it. 42 have ratified those. I'll give you an example. For instance, for us, we've been working with the Caribbean Cyber Security Center, and the Cybersecurity Center has all members from the entire islands involved there. And we, as the ICSPA, again, have that opportunity to kind of bridge the gap and bring in some of our thoughts and have conversations with the leaders of those countries to talk about the working groups and the forums that we attend, the conferences that we go to. And so, when it really comes down to it, in all honesty, it's about the trusted network that all of us have that are on this call today and those that are listening actively, and then being able to be proactive about it.
I have another question here, which I'm going to put on air right now. This is from David Law. This says that you can see it at the top of the screen, just above the screen. And the question is, can one of the speakers say a few more words about the kinds of things that can be done to enhance the resiliency, the resilience of systems once a cyber attack has taken place? So I suppose we're talking specifically about developing countries, but even in advanced, Western and developed countries. I mean, what are some of the actions that can be taken, I suppose, to enhance resilience after an attack, but also enhance resilience of systems before an attack takes place? So maybe we'll start with Jeff here. Jeffrey, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, I would say it's too late, to build in resilience after the attack. So, but I'll give you a good example. The U.S. Department of Defense or the GAO issued a report a few years ago that said that the U.S. Department of Defense had 34, I think it was, critical assets that were reliant upon the public grid, the power grid. So although they may have had a few days of backup, power available to them, if the power grid went out and where they're located, after a few days they'd be shut down. So this was a critical problem that had to be addressed. And the solution was to create for these bases, these critical bases, to create solar-powered grids, microgrids. These would be completely independent from the public grid, so that regardless of what happened to public power, they would still be able to be up and running for a long period of time. And the other benefit was that these microgrids were built, from the ground up, using more secure equipment. They weren't relying upon software that was written back in the 70s or the 80s, and they don't even know who wrote it, if they're alive or dead, and they can't patch it, which is the case on the public grid in the U.S. So I think building in resilience early is critical for being able to keep your infrastructure up and running. How you do that, of course, is going to be dependent on the infrastructure, on the type of infrastructure.
Okay, very interesting. Tim.
I think so. One is the piece of the backup systems to have in place, that if something goes down, that you have a backup system. But that's obviously a cost factor for any entity, be it a company or government as well. Another piece to having a backup system yourself is creating agreements with other entities, so that in case you're subject to an attack, that you're able to divert some of, either if you're talking about a DDoS attack, some of the traffic, or that you're able to use resources from a partner organization. So we saw this and Jeff can probably talk about that more, in the Georgian case, when the Georgian government was subject to a DDoS attack, and it was actually an American company, I believe in Florida, that volunteered to host the website, and then itself became subject to the DDoS attack. So it comes with a certain risk as well. But to cut a long story short, you can have agreements with other entities to make sure that in case you are subject to an attack like a DDoS attack, that there's some sort of assistance, and that goes beyond your own internal systems, that would enhance resilience as well.
Okay. And Ken, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that resiliency is really going to start from the top of the organization. So we deal a lot with organizations at the CEO level, as I mentioned, as well as senior executives in government. So I'll go to an example in the banking industry that I'm familiar with. In London in 2012, there was a war game simulation that was put on that had over 220 bankers, government officials, regulators, all involved collaboratively to test their systems, right? And then they had third parties that were on the outside looking in from an infrastructure perspective, from a data packet perspective. So again, it's when both of the other speakers have mentioned some of the key components here, but it is that proactive behavior of organizations at the senior level where they are engaged to move forward and be resilient.
Another question here, you'll see it at the top of your screen from David McDonough, and he asks a question to all the speakers again. Which developing countries face the most serious cybersecurity threats? So are there certain types, certain particular developing countries that have faced significant amount of cybersecurity threats or more prone to certain types of threats? Are there particular regions, and what types of threats are they? So what specific, I mean, Tim alluded to this in his presentation, but what types of threats are some of these developing countries specifically facing? Maybe I'll start with Tim here and then go to Ken and then Jeff. So Tim, go ahead.
So data and empirical data about the level of threats is something that's really hard to come by, and I'd also caution in terms of when you look at these numbers, what they're talking about. When you hear numbers like millions of attacks happen, I see red flags coming up. That's usually intrusions. So to maybe start with a quick 101 of what a cyber incident could be, one, you need to have access to a system through a vulnerability. And then once you're in the system, you have a payload that does something once you're in the system. So you need to have an intrusion in the system, and that's what often gets confused with a cyber attack. So when we hear the really large numbers of like millions of attacks, it's usually the probing or intrusion of a system. But then the actual, like an attack where something really happens through the payload, those are a lot fewer. So in terms of the kind of threats that you could see, DDoS is something that was mentioned, and I'm going to just talk about DDoS, and Ken and Jeff can talk about some of the other things if they want. DDoS is a distributed denial of service attack, which essentially uses computers of many different users who often don't know that their computers have been hijacked. And it doesn't necessarily just need to be a computer like the old PC, but it could be your smartphone. And your device is turned into a zombie machine through a sort of malware. So you've caught a virus on your machine, and you become part of what's called a botnet, which is essentially many different devices that are all controlled by one person or one entity. And this person gets all of the devices to send requests to a single target at the same point in time, which overloads the capacity of the targeted infrastructure or website, and that can bring down the website, usually just for a temporary time, but not just the website, it can also affect other systems, essentially any system that's connected to the internet and that responds to pings and requests. And that's one of the threats that, if you're talking about the developing countries, is I think definitely one source of concern, because as more and more people become online, they might have a lack of awareness about how to secure their systems on a continuing basis. Their devices can become zombie devices and become part of a larger botnet that could then become used for a DDoS attack down the road.
Interesting. Ken, I saw you nodding your head when I was speaking. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm going to, if I'm correct, just to defer to the original question was really around what countries are susceptible to cyber attacks, if there are any. And I would, I would go back and look over the past decade, specifically at the foreign policy of the United States as one of the key drivers to opening up opportunities for cyber criminals. And that's specifically what I mean by that is, over the past decade, there's been significant investment from China in the Caribbean itself, whether it be in the Barbados and the Dominican, etc. And that investment is in all areas that you would imagine. There's enough data, obviously open source out there, to point to that, whether it's physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, IT infrastructure, etc. And so again, dealing with the folks in the Caribbean, as we have been, we are, as an organization, starting to find out to the what extent their involvement has been. And again, one of the key things behind all of these regions that have issues with cyber crime is the lack of law enforcement and policy, right? So it's one thing to have policy in place, but if you don't have law enforcement capacity to be able to go out and investigate and prosecute, you're going to have significant issues. So when I look at the Caribbean, I think it is one of the highest targeted areas there are in the world. And again, the lack of law enforcement resources, the scale of the crimes, low governmental priority, funding, lack of cross-border and victims' unwillingness to report, all of those are drivers and ultimately creating playgrounds for the belligerents to attack. So.
Okay. Jeff, do you want to come in on this?
Sure. Quickly, I guess I think if depending on how I'm not quite sure what the questioner when in the question is used of the word threats. So I'm not if he was referring to threat actors. Then we might say who are the most serious threat actors out there would be the the developed countries that have advanced cyber warfare capabilities, advanced sabotage capabilities, things like that. So, and whoever they might be targeting would be the ones facing the most serious cybersecurity threat actors. If the question had to do with which country might be most vulnerable, to an attack, I would say those would be the developing countries or countries which are very small that only have sort of limited ISPs. Estonia is actually quite a good example. So there you have a very small country. It's highly wired. Very sophisticated online population. So who rely upon the internet for their daily life, daily activities. And it would be, because it is a small country, it'd be easy, as Tim said, through a denial of service attack or through other means to shut down that connectivity. And that would cause serious disruption, possibly for a very sustained period. So I think small countries that are highly wired are probably the ones that are really facing the most serious disruption. It'd be very hard to disrupt a country the size of the US, because we have so many options and so many points of connectivity. That would be my answer.
Okay. Jeffrey, you talked in your presentation about chaotic actors or extremist actors. I was wondering if perhaps you could say a few words about some of the terrorist organizations, which are primarily based in developing countries, fragile states. You could use, for instance, Islamist extremist organizations who have shown themselves to be quite adept at exploiting technology, using technology. Look at how ISIS, for instance, in Iraq has used social media and for recruiting and so on. They've shown themselves to be much more savvy. Have we seen many of these groups based, again, in developing countries, extremist groups, posing a serious threat to developed countries as well, to Western countries? Are there any examples in particular of the types of threats they posed?
Well, I'm not aware of any cyber terror attacks. So I think that it should be a concern because eventually it'll happen. I just don't know when. But so these groups are already using the internet for training, for recruitment, for propaganda, for communications. They're internet savvy. However, they haven't moved to the point where they are developing a piece of malware for use as a weapon, to cause disruption. So, for example, Bloomberg today put out an investigative article that revealed a very sophisticated attack against NASDAQ that was back in 2010. That took several years to investigate. An attack that had the capability of seriously disrupting our financial trading system. It didn't happen, but it could happen. So in that case, it was probably done by Russian hackers to for the purpose of stealing the technology that NASDAQ ran on. Had it been done by Islamists, extremist, some type of, I hate to pick on any particular religious group. But had it been done by any religious extremist group, with the intention of causing financial chaos, they certainly could have.
Sure.
The only thing missing really is to recruit somebody with the expertise to write that code and plant it. And in fact, planting it is not all that hard, as we saw with Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco lost 32,000 workstations, utterly destroyed by a piece of malware that only worked halfway. The guy who reverse engineered it was only 50% successful in reverse engineering it. It entered the network through a Saudi Aramco office, so it was an insider that plugged a USB stick into a computer, and that was it. Moments later, 2,000 servers, 32,000 workstations were finished. So I think it's really just a matter of time until that happens. It just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. Ken, cyber terrorism emanating from the developing world. Any thoughts on that?
I think Jeff covered them. It's not an area that we, as an organization, focus on. I can tell you one thing, though. If you look around the world, in the developing nations where policy, legislation, and enforcement mechanisms are becoming more robust, there's an argument to be made that the conduit that is the internet allows opportunity for those types of organizations to go into the more susceptible countries that, for instance, as I spoke about for the Caribbean.
Tim, do you have thoughts on this? Sorry.
I share Jeff's assessment. I think there was a brief wave in the late 90s and shortly after 9/11 of cyber terrorism. But then a few years later, after like 5 years, even the terminology changed from cyber terrorism to, I think it's called now, the terrorist use of the internet, in recognition of what Jeff pointed out, that it's being used for communication, as we saw in the Mumbai attacks. And maybe one additional point, while we have the technical vulnerabilities and it could be exploited, the question is also, one, what is cheaper? Is it more costly to actually develop a cyber attack capability, as Jeff outlined? But that also requires a lot of resources in terms of actually finding out what system you want to target and getting probably a copy of the system to figure that out. Or is it cheaper to do the traditional way and having someone in a country to do it? So I think that's one consideration if I put myself in the shoes of someone who was thinking about that. And the other piece is, would it actually also be able to create the same kind of terrorizing effect on the population that these groups want to achieve? And I think here again, there's a question of, if you manipulate data of a financial system, that's probably less interesting for a terrorist group than if you're a state actor from the benefits that you want to derive.
Interesting. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'll ask you one more general question and also ask you if you have any wrap-up remarks that you want to make. But my general question is getting back to kind of the core of our work, which is looking at security assistance and donor security assistance. Are there any, now we already talked earlier about training, collaboration, international organizations, but I mean, if there were any more suggestions you would make or ideas, how could cyber crime, cyber security be built into security assistance from wealthy advanced states, donors, to developing and fragile countries? What type of assistance, if any, should they be providing? Again, we talked to, is it ongoing training? Is it just funds? Is it equipment? Is it about policy? Is this, again, about building international infrastructure, international organizations, international treaties? If we were to speak seriously about how do we, Ken, you talked about law enforcement capacity in the Caribbean. They don't have the capacity. I mean, that gets to the core of what we do, is we often advise on how to develop police capacity. One thing we don't talk about, though, is we often don't talk about the technology, about cyber security capacity. Do we talk about also developing that capacity in individual police departments, in the militaries of these developing countries? So I just wanted to, generally speaking, do you have any thoughts on that? On what types of directions could security assistance take, or and even if it's just that we should look more or do more research in certain areas. I realize that this is still an emerging area. Maybe we'll start with Ken. Ken, what do you think? And by the way, also add any final remarks that you have. Also, feel free to add them then.
Okay, great. Well, that's a loaded question, and there's a few in there. I would say to you this, that I'm going to use Canada as the example because I am a Canadian and I'm very familiar with what critical infrastructure is doing, what Public Safety Canada, which is our version of Department of Homeland Security, is doing, the working groups that are involved there. If there's a direction that we try to give as an organization, it is really to, so let's use in a corporation perspective, regardless of the vertical you're in, whether you're in oil and gas, pharmaceutical, IT, etc. Again, there is a statement that can be made now based upon the supply chain, and we refer to it as the value chain. But the supply chain for an organization, or the value chain that's involved all the way through that, is already set up in a global sphere, if you will. It is truly multidimensional. Parts sourced from, a country in Asia that, send across the world to a company in Canada who's building something. Again, there is an argument to be made that the system is in play today, that if policy and legislation are put in place in these developed countries, those organizations, regardless of the verticals, can use the supply chain that they have to start to push down back onto those parties, those members that are involved into them, to say to them, these are the things that you need to do. This is the awareness that your organization needs to have, whether you're in London, whether you're in Bahrain, it doesn't really matter. You're part of the supply chain. And so in there lies a model, if you will, that organizations and governments can turn to say, listen, it is your responsibility as the organization at the top of the pile, sourcing all of these products and services to build out what you do, to push down this awareness, this education, this training, because there is more and more evidence from an insurance perspective that organizations are going to be called to task. Data breach notification from governments, types of things of that nature are going to force organizations. And so, again, I think maybe a final remark is that the cyber conduit, the highway that we all use today, whether in business, whether in interpersonal exchanges of information, it is in place today for us to push that information down. So,
Thanks very much, Ken. Jeffrey, can I ask you now for your remarks?
Yeah, I'll just give. I'll make 2 points. Regarding developing your work in developing countries. The first is for their critical infrastructure to build in resilience. So their telecommunications, their transportation, air traffic control, their power grid, their water is not as worrisome when it comes to cyber attacks, but for the other 3, you should definitely want to have backup networks that will jump in once the first is impacted, and as much as possible isolate them. So by resilient, I mean that one network, that your backup network has absolutely no connection in any way, shape, or form to your primary network. The second is to understand what value your internal resources have to other countries in the world. So if your small country happens to have natural resources that are critical for China, for example. You need to find ways to protect those resources in terms of intellectual property that emanates from them. So if you have state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises that do mining of rare earths, the information about those mines, about what they contain, about your test results, your locations, and so on, these are things that are high value to a country that needs rare earth minerals. And those should be isolated, segregated, and monitored away from the corporate network. It's treated the same way that a military institution like here in the U.S., where we'll have a unclassified network and a classified network, and the two never touch. At least in theory. So those are two, I think, two important guidelines for any developing country. Know what's valuable to the bigger guys out there, and make sure you've taken steps to protect at least that much, because you'll never keep them out of your network ever. But you should be able to know when somebody touches that material and make it as difficult as possible. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, very interesting. Thanks, Jeffrey. Tim, to wrap us up then.
Yeah, so here in the US, we talk a lot about the whole of government approach when it comes to cybersecurity. I'd extend that and say it must be a whole of society approach, especially if we talk about developing countries and the fact that the governments in many of those countries have limited capacity relative to what we see in many developed countries. And one of the often quoted analogies is with regard to health and the World Health Organization, and thinking about viruses and worms in cyberspace exactly the way that we think about them when it comes to traditional health. And I think that's a particularly useful analogy if we're thinking about the developing world as well, and developing countries. And I think that right now the general challenge is to raise awareness in those countries among the leaders, both in government, in corporations, but also, for example, universities that have played a major role as the internet expanded over the past, and could play a key role, depending on what country we're talking about, to help raise awareness and build up the security level of the country at large. And with that, I also just want to thank you and Mark again, you and Jeff again, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. And to Ken and Jeff.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank all of you. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us and to give your thoughts. This was one of the most disciplined panels in terms of time I've ever been a part of. So this is I'm really thankful for that, and very concise and detailed answers still in a short amount of time. I think we've had a number of interesting points. I think Tim wrapped it up well there. Talking, and Jeff talked about this, and Ken, but understanding the threat is very crucial to the particular developing countries, raising awareness across society, not just within the states, within the governments themselves. And building the capacity in different ways. So I think these this provides a really good launching pad for some work that we want to do on looking at cybersecurity issues and security sector reform. So I think we're going to be in touch, certainly with the three of you. We'll be in touch again with our audience. So I think I'll say on behalf of the audience to thank you all again very much for joining us. Let me just remind everybody that you can access our primer report on this issue on the Center for Security Governance website. And we will have both a summary report, which will lay out some of the key points raised here by our speakers, as well as you'll be able to watch the video again in the coming days and be able to share that as well. I will ask now, I'm going to ask Jeff to put on the screen our poll. You can see at the top there, and I'd even ask our speakers, if you don't mind spending 5 minutes after we end off here, to fill out this poll, which will cover some of the issues you've already spoken about. but it'll just allow us to get a bit of a sense of what people think on some of the key issues we talked about. I'd also ask that please join our mailing list at the Center for Security Governance. We're going to be doing these e-seminars bi-monthly, so every couple of months we'll have a new e-seminar on different issues, and we hope to really seize upon this issue of cybersecurity and technology. So try and join us for future events, and with that, I'd just like to thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you soon. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Please do fill out the poll. All right, bye.
Bye-bye.